I read a recent report where a victim said that what happens in these circumstances is that you become a victim, but you accept what has happened. Even though it goes on, the person you're dealing with apologises, kisses and makes up. And after a while you tend to think that really you're at fault, not them. You think that you're in love with them, but in fact you're not in love with them. You're in love with what you wish they were or what they once were. Now that's a mindset, isn't it? A psychological thing, if you like, that people really have to come to terms with, that they have to accept.
Well, I think everybody in society has to recognise it's a problem. Friends have to recognise it's a problem and confront the partner who's committing the abuse. Governments have to ensure that there are systems in place. The police have to make sure that there's appropriate services there, and actually the woman is treated appropriately and getting support. So right across the system, there needs to be a real fundamental shift if we're going to stop violence against women.
One general perception is that women are more at risk from people they don't know, the man they meet in a dark alley, than from their partners, their close friends. But that's not the reality, is it? The figures certainly suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, research has shown that it's people who are close to you who are the most likely the ones to do the abusing. So it's most likely to be the husband or the partner who's actually causing the violence.
Research referred to in your report, I think in the UK, shows that this person may not be violent in any other circumstance except their domestic or their personal relationship. So it really comes down to a matter of trying to exercise control over the other person, does it?
Yeah, I mean it's about power, it's about control, and it's about the man treating the woman as whether it's a piece of property.
Your report makes the point that while there have been many good things that have been and are being done in Australia, they tend to be often very short term and not particularly well coordinated. I take it what you're suggesting is not that we need to start again by wiping the slate clean, but really there does nonetheless need to be significant change, that there needs to be much greater coordination between various governments, Commonwealth, state and territory, and also between the different agencies that are responsible for this whole area.
Absolutely, and those are some of the kind of key principles that we've identified around the world. That any kind of solution has to be structural. It has to be right across different governments, state and federal, the different authorities. It's not just one person's responsibility. So we're looking for a kind of the wording is a whole of government approach. It means it's everybody's responsibilities. It's not just Tanya Plibersek as Minister for Women, but it cuts across education, it's in the Attorney General's department. It means that the Attorney General has a responsibility to bring together all the Attorney Generals from the states to make sure there is that harmonisation of legislation. So it is something that needs to be done systematically, it needs to be done strategically, and it needs to be sustainable. As you've highlighted, often initiatives can be very good, but it's short-term funding and it's pilots here and it's pilots there. What needs to happen is it needs to be substantially funded, and it needs to be a real commitment, not just short-term.
You mentioned the figure of $8 billion, which is the cost to the Australian economy of domestic violence, but has a figure been put on what needs to be spent to correct this?
Well, as I say, if we're really going to lift our game, then we're looking to the government to look at what's happening around the world. So a six-fold increase is what we'd like in terms
probably
of
unrealistic, but nonetheless
matching what happens in Ireland, and a 50% increase to match the European average.
Just going back to your comment about the Attorneys General, for instance, needing to coordinate their activities, the report does point to some serious shortcomings in the whole area of policing in relation to domestic violence. Sometimes the police aren't particularly sympathetic, sometimes they tend to act as a mediator, which may not be the appropriate role. But what are the sorts of other things that you think need to be focused on here, need to be dealt with?
Amnesty International is very strong on bringing people to justice and holding them to account, whether that's at an international level in terms of a criminal court or at a very local level in terms of a man beating his wife. So in the majority of cases, often, people are not being brought to account in terms of domestic violence. So we're looking to the police to actually really up their game, to actually put into place procedures to support the victim and to ensure that the victim is able then to actually take these things to court and perpetrators are brought to account.
One report I read suggested that often women, when they're in this situation, have to deal with a whole range of different agencies. But what can sometimes happen is that if they don't receive an appropriate level of assistance in terms of the first organisation they deal with, they may just choose to give up. This really goes back to this issue we talked about before in terms of the need for a greater level of coordination to ensure that, if you like, women are given a much greater level of assistance to navigate this path that they have to go down, often a very difficult path that they have to follow.
Absolutely, and one of the things that we've found in our research is a real inconsistency across the board. There are elements of good practice here in Australia, but it shouldn't be a lottery as to where you live, as to the treatment and the support you get. So that's why the harmonisation is so important. That's why ensuring that it goes right across federal and state, and that there are minimum standards in place. Because if you're in Wagga Wagga or if you're in Bunbury, you should have the same access to services, you should have the same access to support, and there should be those same levels of prosecution. But at the moment, sadly, there aren't.
If I can just go to the Northern Territory intervention, I know that Amnesty has some serious concerns in terms of human rights about the intervention. On the other hand, it has led to a reduction in violence against women, in some areas at least. That presents something of a contradiction for Amnesty, doesn't it?
What we've found, because we've been doing a huge piece of consultation in the Northern Territory, and that helped in Amnesty International submission when they did a review of the Northern Territory intervention. And when we went out and we talked to Indigenous men and women and the different communities, is that what they've said to us is there wasn't any consultation with the intervention. Yes, there has been some of the byproducts of the intervention that have been beneficial, but the whole issue of disbanding the Racial Discrimination Act, that's not necessary. There is absolutely no reason why one group of society in Australia is differentiated and discriminated against rather than another. One of the big issues that have come to us from the communities is around the issue of quarantining. There's been blanket quarantining in the Northern Territory as a result of the intervention. And that means that everybody's treated exactly the same. Now, I live in Sydney, and in my street in Sydney, I'm sure behind some of the closed doors there are things happening that shouldn't be happening. But just because it's happening 5 doors down the road from me doesn't mean that I will be treated in exactly the same way. But that's what we've done to the people in the Northern Territory. That's what we've done to the Indigenous population. We've imposed a solution without consultation, and we've taken away their rights. And what Indigenous people have said to us is why? Why is this happening to us? Why are we being treated differently? And why can't the Racial Discrimination Act be reinstated?
We do see and read a lot about the level of violence against women in Indigenous communities. Is this an area of particular concern for you, for Amnesty?
It's a huge area of concern because the figures in terms of violence against women are horrific. They're even worse than they are for the non-Indigenous population. But we don't believe that having blanket quarantining and by taking away the Racial Discrimination Act, that's the answer. The answer is actually to make sure that there are services in place, that there's prevention, that there's prosecution. It doesn't mean that everybody has to be treated in exactly the same way. and we look to the government to reinstate the Racial Discrimination Act, and we're also looking to the government to actually have proper consultation with the Indigenous population.
In terms of the broader violence against women campaign that Amnesty is running, it seems to me there are two basic messages, apart from the need for more money to be spent, two basic messages that come out of your report. First of all, the need for much greater coordination, and secondly, the need for a greater level of flexibility, that you can't take the view that there's a one-size-fits-all solution to all of these problems.
I mean, I think, you know, if history's shown us anything, you know, when we impose solutions, they don't work. And that's why, you know, if you look at what is one of the key principles in the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, consultation is absolutely paramount. And that's what we're looking towards the government to do.
Well, let's conclude on that note. Claire Mallinson, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much for talking to Viewpoint.
Pleasure, Laurie.